Okay, so that's kind of scary. So, so who was the ruler over Persia at the time of the book of Esther? Who was the ruler? Ahasuerus or Xerxes? Yeah, okay. So he was the one that was the king over this huge empire. And in what present day country is Susa, the capital of Persia, located? So this was the Persian Empire, the Mede Persian Empire. So Susa was the capital. But in what modern day country is Susa? There you go. Okay. Yes, Iran. So just so we recognize, okay, we call it by a different name now, but it is a real place. This really happened, and it was a real event located in what we now call Iran. Okay, so Ryan gave us this timeline um, a week or two ago, and we remember how the Assyrians took Judah into captivity in 606. And then after 70 years in captivity, the first group of exiles was allowed to return back to Jerusalem to build the temple, and Cyrus gave them funds to do that. And there were like about 50,000 Jews that went back with the Zerubbabel in 536. So, and many Jews remained in Persia, thousands of Jews remained in Persia all across this vast empire. And so when the story of Esther begins, it's been 53 years since that first group returned back. Now, there's going to be a couple of more groups that are going to go back. They'll be after the book of Esther, but it's been about 53 years since that first group of 50,000 Jews returned to Jerusalem. These Jews that remained in Persia, they were exiles. They were not allowed to leave. They didn't have free will to leave the land of Persia. And they continued to pray to God, to worship Him in this foreign land. And they believed in the prophets who had foretold about the coming Messiah. They knew that was going to happen. They just didn't know when. And so the Jews were located over this vast empire of about 2 million square miles. So for comparison, the 48 contiguous states of the US comprise a little more than 3,000 square miles. So this is a little bit smaller, a third smaller than the size of our continental US. Okay, so it's a huge empire. And Xerxes or Ahasuerus had divided this big empire into 127 provinces. So you can imagine how hard it would have been to maintain control over an empire this spread out, without modern communication. He was a very wealthy, a very powerful king, and nobody could enter into his court without permission. Okay, so just a couple of questions. What was the relationship between Mordecai and Esther? And I'll start with this section. Who can tell me that? And you can look in your Bibles if you want to. What was the relationship between Mordecai and Esther? Thank you. All right, so they're cousins. And so Mordecai had adopted Esther. He was her cousin, older than her, and she didn't have father or mother. So he took her in, he raised her, and so she regarded him as like her father. Okay, so how did Mordecai find out about what was happening to Esther each day? Somebody in this section. Yes, he sat outside the gate. We see that mentioned several different times in the book of Esther. And, it makes me wonder if maybe he had some kind of job there outside of the palace in the king's gate, because every time it mentions he was there. Maybe he was old and didn't have a job and was there, but anyway, he was there outside the gate, so he was kind of keeping tabs on what was happening to Esther. She had been taken into the king's palace, she had been made queen, and so he's kind of keeping an eye out for her there. All right, so that's how he's finding out every day. So what's something that Mordecai discovered as he sat outside the king's gate? What plot did he discover? Somebody in this section. Yeah, assassinate him. Yes. So Mordecai tells Esther, and Esther tells the king about this plot. And what happens? What did the king do to them? What happened to Bigthan and Teresh? Yep, killed them. Yes. And so did Mordecai get any credit for that? No. It was just, Esther had told the king how she knew. The king had the matter checked into, and sure enough, they were planning to kill him. And so, he has them killed. No recognition, no anything to Mordecai. So now we read about Haman and Mordecai. And what did Mordecai refuse to give to Haman? This section. Yes, he refused to bow down to him. And that just made Haman furious. It was a matter of strong principle to to Mordecai, because he refused to change about that even when his life was threatened. So how did Haman seek to get even with Mordecai? Yes. Yeah, first of all, he wanted to, he built a gallows, and yes, he came up with a plan. You're right, he came up with a plan to get rid of all the Jews first, and he talked the king into it, and told the king there's a certain people that scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom, and they obey laws that are different than yours, and it's like, we need to get rid of them. And so he didn't, I don't know, did Haman actually say they were Jews, or did he just say they were a people that, in verse 8 of chapter 3, yeah, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. So he didn't say they were Jews. He just, trumped up these charges against his people and said, you need to get rid of them. And of course, he has in mind getting rid of Mordecai and all the Jews, all of his people. Okay, so a letter was sent by couriers into all the king's provinces that on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, they were all going to be destroyed. All the Jews are going to be killed, annihilated. Children, women, young and old, everybody. That was his plot, that was his plan, and he had the king's authority behind it. Now there's a decree that says this is going to happen. And it's like 11 months later that what are the Jews going to do? They can't flee, they can't get away, and every day that ticks on the clock, we're one day closer to this terrible annihilation of hundreds of thousands of Jews being killed. So what did Mordecai do when he first found out about Haman's plan? What did Mordecai do? Sackcloth and ashes, and goes back to the king's gate, and he's there, and he gets word to Esther that this is going to happen. And what does he tell Esther she needs to do? Yes, tell the king that this plan needs to be averted. This is awful. But why was Esther hesitant about going before the king? Yes, right. Nobody got access to the king unless he called for them without him granting them approval. So what did Mordecai tell Esther would happen to her if she remained silent? Yeah. Don't think just because you're the queen in this palace that you're going to escape destruction. You're going to be killed just like all the other Jews if you are silent and don't say anything. And he said, who knows but that you're come to this place in the kingdom for such a time as this. So what did Esther request that all of the Jews in Susa, the Shushan, do for her? Fast, yes. And she said, I and my maidens will fast for the next, how many days? 3 days. And Mordecai, you tell all the Jews in Shusha, in the city, in the capital city, to be praying to be fasting for me. Now, it's interesting that the text does not say pray. It says fast. So, are we assuming too much if we assume that, is it logical to assume that they were praying as they were fasting? And I see a lot of heads shaking up and down, and I agree. I think so, because, there are some passages, if you look in Jeremiah chapter 14 and verse 12, God is saying, although, and this is a little different time period, but he's talking about people who were not following God. And God said, although they fast, I will not listen to their cry. I will not accept them. Instead, I will destroy them with a sword, famine, and plague. So fasting and praying go together. And in Joel chapter 1 and verse 14, Joel said, declare a holy fast, call a sacred assembly, and cry out to the Lord. So praying and fasting went together. So I think it is very logical for us to assume that when it says, I'm going to fast, you tell all the other Jews in the city to fast, it also means to pray, because I'm going to be doing the same thing. Okay, so Esther in chapter 5, how did she get the king's attention? She comes into his palace, and this is on the 3rd day. They've been praying, they've been fasting. This is a major event that we're talking about. All of the Jews are going to be killed, destroyed. So if there ever was a time to pray and fast, this is it. And so that's what's been going on the last 3 days. And now Esther comes before the king, and he gives her the golden scepter, and he says, Esther, what do you wish? What's your request? It shall be given to you up to half the kingdom. And so she doesn't immediately tell him what she wants. She says, I'm going to have a banquet, going to have it for you and for Haman. And so if you can come today for that. And so the king says, yep, let's come. Haman, let's go to the banquet. So he goes, and so he says, okay, now tell me, after they've banqueted, what do you want? Up to half the kingdom. And Esther says, well, my petition is this: I want to have another banquet tomorrow, and you and Haman come back to that. So Haman goes home, and yes, ma'am. Okay, did you have a question or comment? Okay. Well, all right, so they leave, and Haman goes out, and boy, he is on cloud 9, isn't he? Esther, she thinks the world of me. The king thinks the world of me. It couldn't get much better than this. Things looked really good to him and for him. He goes home and brags to his wife and his friends and, boasts about his wealth and his family and how everything's going so good. And, Esther's even invited me, only me and the king, to another banquet tomorrow. So, but, as he left, what happened? Who did he see in the king's gate? Mordecai. And Mordecai's still not bowing to him. And it's like, this is, it just really gets to him. And he goes home and he tells them that, and their solution is build a gallows and hang, get the king to hang Mordecai. So that night, the king can't sleep. And so he calls for the records to be brought to him, and the records just happened to be read that Mordecai had revealed this plot against him some time ago, and nothing had been done to honor him. So that gets the king to thinking, here he comes in, Mordecai comes in right about that time. It must have been extremely early in the morning. The king hadn't been able to sleep, and he's learned all this. And so now the king is ready to do something good for Mordecai. And he says, Haman, what do you think we ought to do for this person that I want to honor? And Haman thinks it's going to be him. And so he comes up with this elaborate thing of, bring the royal robe that the king has worn and put him on a horse the king has ridden and go through the city streets and proclaim, this is what's going to be done for the person that the king wants to honor. So what comment or question did you have? Yeah. Yes, right. I mean, to offer her up to half the kingdom, she held a special place in his heart. I mean, he dearly loved her. He was willing to do anything for her. And if something was troubling her, and when he found out, that she needs something, he's all ears. Okay, so Mordecai's come in that next morning really early, planning to ask the king to hang Mordecai on those gallows that he had built late last night. And instead, he gets told, you're the one that's going to go around the city leading this horse and praising Mordecai. I mean, he's just devastated. He goes back home. He tells his wife and friends what's happened. And they're like, well, Mordecai is a Jew. His stock's going up and yours is coming down. And indeed, that's what was happening. And so he, evidently he forgets about going to the banquet because the king sends his chamberlain to get him and bring him back to the second banquet. So here we are in chapter 7. All right, so, and just an application here. When Mordecai told Esther, hey, I know that you're scared to go into the king because you haven't been summoned for 30 days and everything, but just be aware, if you don't do this, the Lord is not going to spare you. You're going to be destroyed. And the Lord is going to spare the Jews. Deliverance is going to come to everybody else, even if you don't say anything to the king. But here's your opportunity. Take advantage of it. So the right word of encouragement, the right admonition, the right rebuke to a brother or sister can really go a long way. So Esther then makes her request to the king. She goes into the feast, or the king and Haman go into the feast, and on the second day, the king says to Esther, what is your wish? it will be granted you. What is your request? Even to half the kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. And Esther said, if I found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. In other words, if we had just been sold into slavery, if that's what had happened, I wouldn't have said anything to you, O king, because our affliction would not have been important enough to bring to your attention. And so the king says to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he? Who has dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe and enemy, this wicked Haman. And so Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. So the king arises in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed behind to beg for his life from Queen Esther because he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine. As Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was, he was begging her for his life. The king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? And as the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face as a sign that he was about to be the recipient of the king's wrath. And then Harbona, one of the chamberlains in attendance on the king, said, moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the wrath of the king abated. So, life application number 2, Haman was full of arrogance and pride, and we know that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Be careful not to think too highly of yourself. Things are going really good, so it seemed to Haman, but wow, was his fall ever quick and mighty. Proverbs 18:7 says, the mouth of fools are their undoing, and their lips are a snare to their very lives. Proverbs 29:6 says that evildoers are snared by their own sin, but the righteous shout for joy and are glad. And Jesus said in Matthew 23, he that is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted. James chapter 4, 6, and 7 says, but he gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. And it's interesting to note that after this happened to Mordecai, after he was paraded through the streets on the king's horse and extolled for his good deeds, he didn't let it go to his head. He goes right back to his place at the king's gate. Another life application is don't seek praise for the good that you do. Mordecai didn't concern himself with the fact that the king had never rewarded him for revealing that assassination plot to him. He just continued doing the things he'd been doing, just doing right. And Matthew 6 tells us to be careful not to practice our righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. The Lord promises to reward those who diligently seek him. His praise is really all that matters. So the king gave Haman's estate to Esther, and the king had Mordecai brought before him because Esther had now told him about their relationship. And the king took off his signet ring, he gave it to Mordecai, and Esther set Mordecai over Haman's estate so that Mordecai now occupied the place that Haman had had. But the potential harm to the Jews was not undone yet. The decree had been made for their destruction, and the law of the Medes and Persians could not be changed. They could not revoke that law that was on the books to destroy the Jews. So, with tears, Esther fell before the king and begged him to deal with the threat that still remained to her people. And the king held out his royal scepter to her, and she arose. She stood before him while she said, "If it pleases the king, and if I found favor with the king, let it be written that the letters Haman wrote ordering the Jews to be destroyed be revoked." And Ahasuerus said to Esther and Mordecai, "Look, I've given Esther the estate of Haman, and he himself has been hanged because he put forth his hand upon the Jews. Write to the Jews as it pleases you, and seal it with my ring, making it irreversible. But Haman's letter itself cannot be revoked." So the royal scribes were assembled once more. By now, it was the 23rd day of the 3rd month. So it had been 2 months since that first decree had been sent out. And so Mordecai composed the letter. It was sent out to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, the princes of all the provinces, according to every man's language and according to the Jews' language. So, there was no way they could just strike that letter, that law off the books. But they did devise a plan to circumvent that annihilation. And that was to allow the Jews to defend themselves. So the official messages were written in the name of the king, and they were sent out from India to Ethiopia, to the far reaches of the Persian Empire. The couriers rode on horses from the king's own stock, and they were urged on their way by the king's own command. And this new decree said, "Jews in every city may gather together for their defense to destroy all who want to molest them. They may kill, destroy, and annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including women and children, and then they may plunder their spoil. This is to be done in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th day of the 12th month," and that's the exact same day when the edict from Haman gave the enemies of the Jews the right to fight them. So now word spread that the queen, Esther, was a Jew, and that one of the highest nobles of the king was a Jew, Mordecai. So no one would be eager to kill any Jews now. And so Mordecai goes out from the king's presence, dressed in royal apparel of blue and white, with a crown of gold and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan shouted with great joy. For the Jews there was light and gladness and joy and honor. And when the decrees arrived in the various places all over this empire, wherever the Jews were, they rejoiced with feasts and celebrations. And many among the people became Jews themselves, became proselytes, because the fear of the Jews was fallen upon them. So now the tables were turned. When the day came, which Haman had chosen for the slaughter of the Jews gathered themselves together and fought their enemies. They searched for those who had wanted to harm them and executed them all. The day that had been set aside for the enemies of the Jews to gain mastery over them became a day when the Jews gained the mastery over their enemies. And even all the Persian officials throughout the empire had been so impressed with the honor the Jews now had because of Mordecai, they assisted the Jews in destroying their enemies. Indeed, Mordecai was great in the kingdom, and his fame just continued to spread throughout all the provinces. The task was done on that one day in the provinces, and in Shushan they slew 500 men, including Haman's 10 sons. But the job still was not finished. So when the report of the success of the Jews was reported to the king asked Esther if she had any further request. And she replied, "If it please the king, let tomorrow also be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do tomorrow as they have done today. And please let Haman's sons be hanged on the gallows." So Ahasuerus granted them the permission. And so the Jews killed 300 more of their enemies in Shushan on that second day. But note that they did not lay their hands on any of the plunder, just as they had not done the day before. The Jews out in the provinces had succeeded in killing 75,000 of their enemies, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder either. On the 14th day, the day after killing their enemies, they took a day for rest and celebration. The Jews in Shushan took the 15th day as their day of celebration, since they were still destroying enemies on the 14th day. Mordecai then sent out letters that the Jews should celebrate both the 14th and the 15th days from that time forward. It was a time to remember how their sorrow had been turned into gladness and how their mourning had been turned into a holiday. The holiday that was going to be celebrated every year for 2 days was called Purim, the plural form of Pur, to remind them of the lot that Haman had used to choose the day when he planned to destroy the Jews. And so it became a custom to the Jews of that generation and to all their generations after them, so that they would celebrate their deliverance according to their appointed times every year. And the text tells us that all the accomplishments of King Ahasuerus and of Mordecai were written in the book of the Chronicles of the Medes and Persians. For Mordecai was second only to the king himself, and he was very great among the Jews because he sought the good of his people and had spoken up for the welfare of the whole nation. The Jews still keep this feast today in March. It's still called Purim, and as a matter of fact, it's coming up this weekend on Saturday and Sunday are the days when the Feast of Purim is going to be celebrated among the Jews this year. And there's really no book in the Bible where the providence of God is seen more clearly than in the book of Esther. And it's even more remarkable that the name of God is not mentioned anywhere in the book. And even prayer and thanksgiving are not mentioned specifically in the book, although it's implied repeatedly. Okay, so any comments or questions about what we've talked about? So I'm impressed with how Esther knew the power of prayer and fasting. You know, when this happens, when she becomes aware of this, and Mordecai urges her on to go to the king and ask that the Jews be granted deliverance. You know, the first thing she thinks about doing is fasting and praying. What do we do when we face a major obstacle or temptation? Do we consider the power of prayer? Is that our first response? That, hey, this is something that I need help with. And let me ask my brethren to pray with me. And especially if we're all praying, you know, at the same time, in unison. I know you're praying for me, and I'm praying for this also. And, you know, and strong faith really can move mountains. And we have to pray believing that God will answer our prayer and that it is something that God can do. It does no good to pray for something and we think, well, not really sure God can do this, but I'm going to pray anyway. Well, God says, you pray without doubting. If you expect me to answer your prayer. In Mark chapter 11, and Jesus answered them, have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also who is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. You may have something that looks like an insurmountable mountain, but God can change it, just like he changed this. It looked really gloomy and despairingly for the Jews, but he heard their prayers and he changed it. James chapter 5 and verse 16, therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. Mordecai was really respected and among the Jews and among all the multitudes. It says in Esther 10 and verse 3, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. He wasn't so concerned about himself. He had not been, it didn't bother him that he didn't get rewarded for revealing that assassination plot. That didn't matter to him. But when it came to God's people, he was concerned about that. And he was willing to put his life on the line, and he encouraged Esther to do the same. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, Paul wrote, love doesn't seek her own interest and doesn't insist on its own way. Especially when we disagree with our brethren, do we have the attitude of Mordecai? Are we seeking the welfare of God's people and speaking peace to them? Now, I recognize that in matters where, God said this, we got to do this. I'm talking about things that are matters of opinion, or specifically if we're disagreeing with our brethren. Do we have the attitude of the welfare of God's people is what's really important, and seeking truth is what's really important, like Mordecai did here. He didn't insist on getting his own way. And finally, we can have great confidence in the mercy of God. Mordecai had that kind of confidence. He knew that deliverance would come, even if it wasn't through Esther. Mary, when she was told that she was going to have Jesus, she praised God for his mercy. In Luke chapter 1 and verse 50, she said in her song of praise, and his mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. In Psalm 103, verse 17, but the steadfast love of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting on those who fear him, and his righteousness to children's children. Okay, we've got about 3 minutes left, and I am out of material. So Do any of you have any comments? This would be a real good time for you to make some. I appreciate the job that Ryan and Mark did in teaching these chapters before the ones I was assigned, and appreciate Ryan letting me borrow a couple of his slides to give. So I've learned a lot from studying, and my faith has been bolstered. I hope that yours has too. So if there's no other comments or questions from anybody, we'll go ahead and be dismissed. Thank you.